Chapter 321. Vile Waters. Maybe she can heal Azra, but is it worth the risk, he thought, walking through the swamp grasses at the edge of the water. But I can minimize the risk, and before I try anything, perhaps I can test the swamp woman's strength. He nodded. As he walked towards lamp and dark, Jay thought of a few problems with making contact. There was a slight chance she had a communication crystal and would warn Estrada, which would send mage hunters directly to his location, whom he had worked so hard to escape, concealing and throwing them off his trail. Or so he thought. She could be so powerful that she could crush him and his skeletons. He didn't even know what kind of magic she could wield. Like the light stalking them, she may be capable of causing wounds that don't heal, wounds that shift back to the victim, no matter if they cut their leg off. If he went himself, it would be too risky, but if he sent his skeletons, she would react with fear or aggression. If he went with his skeletons, the same would probably happen, and it would still be just as risky. Jay made it to dark and lamp, and since there were no lights pursuing them anymore, he had Blue recall its 5 sub-skeletons. Jay made sure they all moved slowly and quietly, in order to not alert the hunchback woman with their tapping bones, as he began the first steps of his plan. Archers. Go. Jay ordered, pointing into the swamp water, giving the level 1 skeleton a series of commands. The skeleton moved slowly into the water, not causing any splashes, and only causing as many ripples as the decaying gas bubbles. Archers kept moving slowly as it sunk deeper into the water and disappeared. The only traces of the skeleton were the bubbles it released with each step, and gentle movements of water. Otherwise, it was completely silent and undetectable. As it waded through the black waters, Jay sensed it moving about 20 feet deeper, watching bubbles making a patch across the surface, until he could no longer see through the heavy fog. Yet, after a moment, Archers stopped. He heard more bubbles bursting on the surface as exp notifications suddenly appeared. 1exp 1exp 1exp. Your skeleton has been slain. Jay took a few steps back from the edge of the water. Damn it, he thought, frowning. A swarm of tiny creatures must have feasted on its bones. Jerry summoned archers, hastily made it some daggers, and commanded Blue to send 2 of its sub-constructs in with it. If they can't get past a few swamp creatures, I'll need to send some bigger skeletons in. Jay thought, watching the 3 of them enter the murky waters again. More bubbles rose as they moved under the water, and soon enough, the notifications began again. 1exp 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 1exp. A skeleton has been slain. Larger bubbles burst to the surface, causing splashes. Jay could only hope that the woman didn't see it or get suspicious. 1exp 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 1exp. Your skeleton has been slain. 1exp 1exp. A skeleton has been slain. Jay was getting annoyed as he watched larger bubbles bursting on the surface, making a louder commotion, but he noticed something interesting about the notifications. A skeleton, my skeleton has been slain. Jay raised a brow, seeing that the death notifications were slightly different. Well, it's good there's a distinction between the sub-skeletons dying and my own. He nodded, a little less annoyed. It was time to send in some larger skeletons. The smaller ones only had about 10 health, while the ones like Sweeper and Lamp had 55, with a bonus 20 health from their spectral armor. Sweeper, you can lead the way. Jay ordered, summoning archers back again. He also released some extra bones so Blue could summon its 2 dead skeletons back. Usually Jay would be low mana by now, but Archers was a level 1 skeleton, and only needed 5 mana to summon. It also needed about half as much bone mass as other skeletons, but with the hundreds of thousands of leftover Helvetian skeletons in Jay's gauntlet, it was negligible. Sweeper slowly trudged into the water, readying its weapon as the 3 smaller skeletons followed it. Since it was heavier, it set free many more of the trapped swamp bubbles, but because the skeletons had already passed this way, it wasn't too loud. Since Sweeper was taller, it was the last to disappear, and sank lower into the abyss. I suppose I should look for other ways to cross. Jay thought, glancing around. Even before Sweeper entered battle, he was thinking of axe designs to hack down a dead tree, which he would use to float a skeleton across. It would annoy him to send a few skeletons far enough away, so that he wouldn't be able to hear the chopping noises of the axes. Suddenly, the water started splashing again. Much larger bubbles rose to the surface as Sweeper and the 3 skeletons engaged whatever was down there. 1exp 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 x 21. A skeleton has died. 1exp x 18. They seem to be doing better this time, Jay thought. Still, he was preparing himself to craft a bone axe. Over the next few minutes, bubbles continued to rise to the surface as many exp notifications came in. Yet the water settled down. The exp notifications slowed to a stop until there was one final large one. 30 exp. Wonder what that was. Jay scratched his chin. Unfortunately, nothing floated to the surface other than bubbles, which also stopped. Sweeper, escort archers to the other side and then come back. Blue, bring your subskeleton back. I want to inspect it. Blue nodded, and the subskeleton returned. While it came back, Jay made sure that Sweeper and archers continued to crawl to the island, and to move slower the closer they got to it, as to not alarm the woman with rising swamp bubbles. In a few moments, the black water rippled and the skeleton's skull rose out, stained a few shades darker because of the vile waters. Yet as it got closer, it wasn't the only thing that was exiting the swamp, as some things clung to its bones, too. The leftovers of the underwater battle. Jay finally saw what the skeletons were fighting underwater. Or at least, the remains of them. Chapter 322. First Command. The skeleton had chunks and chips of bone missing. Much of its ribcage had been eaten, and some of its harassers were still clinging to its body. Short, yellow curved beaks, shaped like parrot beaks, had dug into the bones and stuck there while trying to chip off whatever they could. Their bodies were long, black and slimy like eels. They were skinny though, about as slender as an arrow shaft, while their beak heads were about the size of a sword pommel. All of their bodies had been severed by the bone weapons, so it was hard to tell how long these creatures grew to, but it wouldn't matter if there were hundreds of them, and about 15 of their corpses clung to the skeleton's body. Ugh, gross little things, Jay thought, stepping back from the water and the skeleton coming out of it. Well, it was a subconstruct of Blue's. He found that he could unsummon it. Jay gathered the bones into his gauntlet and released a few fresh sets, so Blue could summon its sub-skeletons back. Blue would need some time to recover its mana, but at the moment they had time as they waited for the other skeletons to complete their mission. On the swamp island, the dark waters rippled as a small skull slowly rose out of the water, only showing its glowing green eyes above the surface. As per its master's instructions, archers kept most of its body in the water, and covertly slid itself slightly onto the muddy bank, hiding its head behind a rotted log and some swamp grasses. While stealthily traveling underwater, it had gathered some handfuls of muck and decaying black leaves which it piled onto its body, to hide its ashen gray bones. Its bones were already a few shades darker from the black water. After it was sufficiently concealed on the edge of the woman's island, it let its eyes go dim, hiding its presence completely. Further behind it, Sweeper lurked below the waters, ready to fend off any more of those bone-eating eels, which may try to eat Archer's lower body before it completed its mission. Jay sensed them stop moving, so he guessed they must be in position. He briefly used the host skill on Archers, and while looking through his eyes, he saw it had a good view of the front door of the woman's rotting cabin, and happy with its positioning, he ended the host skill. Jay glanced at Azra, seeing her wincing in pain. "I'll get you fixed up soon, Azra. The lights don't come near this area, so I'm sure she'll have answers." she. Azra raised a brow, trying not to show any signs of pain, as she wondered what Jay was talking about. "Oh, the lights throwing fireballs had stopped chasing us when we got closer to the swamp." Jay pointed across the water. "Just past this fog and over the water, there's a woman living on a small island, a large beastly-looking woman. I'm betting she knows something about this wound you have. The lights are avoiding her, after all." Azra still frowned in pain, but against Jay's expectation, she didn't show any doubt in him or question anything. Instead, she nodded, accepting his plan and trusting him as she closed her eyes. Jay raised a brow. "She trusts me. Even while she's in pain, she doesn't lash out at me or put me down." Jay wasn't sure what to think as he glanced at her, watching her for a moment. She seemed so different to the humans he knew, and he wondered if it was a vampire thing or an Azra thing. "I suppose I'll find out when I meet other vampires, if I meet them at all." While Jay wanted to venture into the clutches of a vampire academy and feast upon the knowledge of vampire-style necromancy, he couldn't be sure of his safety. He wondered if he decided not to go in, what would he do with Azra? Of course, there was always the option of becoming so powerful that he could send his skeletons to storm the school and take whatever he wanted, waiting in a safe location. Yet that would come with its own difficulties. Jay didn't want to make himself an enemy of an ancient race of vampires who would, perhaps, be proud enough and have long enough memories for vengeance. And these ancient beings would certainly have their own high-level powerhouses, which could take decades to catch up to. Yet for now, his priority was to help Azra. With archers in position, they waited. Jay had commanded archers to give Red a signal when it saw the swamp woman again, but now he was just waiting. NEO v Euros Rapture marked the initial hosting of this chapter on NEO Circumflex v Euros LSZN. Within 10 minutes, he was sitting down in a bone pile, running his fingers along his sword. Releasing a small amount of mana from his fingers, about the size of a candle flame, he traced them along the blade, while manipulating the mana to squeeze and sharpen the edge. Jay sighed as more time passed and there was still no signal, so he gave the skeletons something productive to do. Dark, lamp, handy. You can go out and hunt some lights. Jay waved his hand, shooing them away. Blue, send the sub-skeletons to assist. The 3 skeletons crept off into the fog, each of them taking different directions. They left slowly to keep their noise to a minimum. Blue nodded to Jay and commanded the sub-skeletons. It pointed a skeletal finger into the fog, and all 7 sub-skeletons left Blue's 5 and Red's 2 guardians. How Blue can command sub-skeletons of others. Jay raised a brow. The commander role seems quite useful. I wonder how the chain of command would be affected if there were another commander. Jay decided to test something. Red, bring your sub-skeletons back. Red glanced at Blue and then looked into the fog, and within a few seconds Jay sensed the 2 guardian skeletons coming back. Alright, let Blue use them for now. Red nodded, and went back to its normal guard stance, keeping its gaze over the black swamp, in case anything sprang out, and its 2 guardian skeletons disappeared into the fog again. I see Red's commands take priority over Blue's orders, but Blue can give them orders, while Red doesn't need them, he nodded, scratching his chin. Quite an efficient system, as an elder skeleton like Red can decide for itself if it needs them, and any surplus troops can be used by the commanders. Blue waited by Jay's side, and he gave it one more order. Try to bring some of their bodies back. I want to see what these things are. Blue nodded, and Jay hoped they would bring something back that wasn't mangled beyond recognition. I wonder what their bodies look like. It seems that they float and at least part of them are made from flames, or at least they emit flames from a part of their body, Jay thought, wondering if the burned tree trunks were like their homes or nests. Chapter 323. Leaves. Before the skeletons could bring a corpse of the flame beings back, Red gave Jay a signal with a nod. Archers saw the swamp woman leaving her shack, and alerted Red. In a few seconds, Jay was looking through its eyes, using the host skill. Archers, make sure you hide your eyes, Jay commanded, while seeing the world in its black and white vision. As the green glow from Archer's eyes dimmed down, he noticed that the world seemed to get darker, and he couldn't see as far through the fog. So there's a trade-off. The more their eyes glow, the better their shade vision works, fairly similar to luminous orbs. Yet Jay didn't dwell on these thoughts, as he had been waiting for this woman to leave her shack. She didn't seem alarmed in the slightest, so he was sure the presence of his skeletons and himself across the swamp were still undetected. The woman yawned and scratched her belly as she looked around her island, not noticing the hidden skeleton that Jay was hosting to analyze her. Higatha level 27. HP, 100%. MP, 0%. Damn it, level 27. It was concerning, as she would be much more powerful than Jay, but something seemed odd. 0 mana. If she wasn't just resting, then what was she doing? She either used up her mana, or perhaps something is wrong with her mana. Jay wondered, deciding it needed further investigation. I wonder if he has something to do with the fog or the lights. He ended the host skill, leaving Archer's body. In case Azra was watching or listening, Jay walked up to Blue and began to whisper his orders to it. Blue, recall Dark, Lamp and Handy. Surround the island with archers and sweeper, but stay underwater and leave Red with us. Red, bring your guardians back to guard us. I'll keep Blue's 5 sub-skeletons out to keep hunting those lice, Jay thought. In the meantime, I'll wait to see if her mana goes up. I'm pretty sure I saw her controlling the leaves before, but I can control the skeletons even when I have 0 mana, so there's a chance the leaves could be some kind of constructs or even sentient. Jay wondered. Or maybe she's just low mana, at least that's the simple explanation, he thought with a nod. After a few moments the skeletons returned. A few had scorch marks on their bones while others were untouched, but none of them had any corpses to present to Jay. He had not received any exp notifications either, so it seemed they were unsuccessful. Perhaps the lights were voiding them now after realizing their flames couldn't really hurt the skeletons. Jay would have done the same thing, and thought the fog lights probably had as much intelligence as the skeletons, if not more. Under Blue's command, the skeletons assembled and formed a cinch-file line as they crept into the water. If they're in a line, only the one at the front will cause swamp bubbles to release, Jay thought, nodding approvingly. He was glad that Blue had been watching and thinking for itself, while he sent Sweeper and archers across the first time. I wonder just how much Blue picks up as it watches me and carries out my orders. Jay watched Blue's body slowly disappear into the dark swamp waters. Red, is she still outside? He asked. Red nodded its skull. Jay used the host skill on archers again, and analyzed the swamp woman who was still outside her shack. She was meandering about, collecting some ashes from an old fire pit, along with mushrooms near the water's edge. Jay couldn't tell what she was doing, but as neither of the ingredients were magical, it didn't matter to him. What was important was her current mana. It was still at 0%. A cunning smile appeared on Jay's face as he ended the host skill, and waited for the underwater skeletons to get into position. Not long now, he thought. Jay waited by Azra's side as he sensed the skeletons sneaking around the edges of the island, a lurking threat right under the swamp woman's nose. He had put out a pile of bones for Azra to lay on, so she wouldn't get wet on the ground, and so none of the vile swamp bugs would get into her wound. Blue, wait till she gets close to the edge of the water. Jay gave the order as a sort of guidance, a recommendation, though he was sure the skeleton would have already had the same idea, and he left the rest in Blue's command. Jay stared across the still water, into the fog, and suddenly, he heard splashing sounds coming from the island. Blue executed the plan. Here we go, Jay thought. He quickly used the host skill on archers, and watching what was happening through its eyes. Skeletons burst out of the dark waters, covered in slime and muck which didn't bother them in the slightest. They surrounded the swamp woman who was shaking and barely able to find her feet. She gripped her mushrooms so tightly in shock that she crushed them. She scrambled back to the safety of her hut, but another skeleton appeared, dashing around the side of the rotting shack and cutting off her exit. She wouldn't have made it anyway. Clawed skeletal fingers had clutched her ankle like a snare. Two others grabbed her wrists and pulled her to a stop. Help me, you stupid things. She growled, with her wretched raspy voice calling to the rotting shack. What is she called for? For a level 27, her strength is pretty weak. Maybe I've overestimated her. While Jay watched, more skeletons jumped on her and held her down, but something began to come from the rotting hut. It didn't come out through the doors or windows, but was part of the hut itself. The leaves, I was right. They're constructs. A stream of floating leaves flowed through the air towards the skeletons, and after a moment the stream of leaves grew into a river, like giant flying curtains. Each leaf was about the size of a thumb, and seemed like a giant swarm of insects about to consume whatever was in their path. The leaf swarm met the swords of two skeletons, and as the swords whipped through the air, they didn't cut many leaves apart, they were simply too light. All they managed to do was bat a few away, but it made no difference to a swarm of hundreds, maybe thousands, of these sentient leaves. NEOV Euros Rapture marked the initial hosting of this chapter on NEO Circumflex v Euros LSZN. I wonder, will Blue try to escape into the water? I suppose it depends how dangerous the leaves are. Jay decided to let Blue make the decisions. He was curious to see what it would do, but also wanted to train its mind. Through the eyes of archers, Jay could see that many of the sentient leaves were dry and curled up into crunchy-looking balls, while others seemed plump, green and flexible. It was easy to tell they were old and gray or young and green, but most of them, about 90%, were of the old and dried-out variety. They would not survive a little water. But how are they dried out in this thick, humid swamp? Jay wondered. The two skeletons were above to be engulfed in leaves, while the other four held the swamp woman down. She has low strength, so she must be a mage, but what kind of mage? And how dangerous? And what will you do if she is dangerous, Blue? Chapter 324. Ember Shadow. 30x. It was Blue's sub-skeletons that had claimed a life, as the other skeletons were preoccupied. The swarm of leaves engulfed the two skeletons, dark and handy. They were both still covered in slime and muck from the bottom of the swamp, and the dry leaves quickly absorbed all the darkened swamp water, uncaring that it hurt themselves. It was hard to tell how much the water would hurt the leaves, but Jay was more worried about the skeletons. Their entire frames were covered by leaves. Every single one of their ribs, their jaws, even the insides of their skulls, were not free of them. The leaf-covered skeletons were still slashing away, but their movements got slower, as the leaves clung to their bodies, and tried to hold them into place. Next, the leaves changed tactic and tried to lift them up, attempting to float the skeletons into the air. They had success with Dark. The leaves coated every part of its bone. They pushed and pulled it into the air. But before they could take it higher, a skeletal hand grabbed Dark's leg. Handy had reached out. Handy was a larger skeleton, and its body was covered in swamp slime, weighing it down. While Handy couldn't see what its hand was grabbing, Blue could. Blue had instructed the skeleton with perfect precision, as if Blue was in control of Handy's body, making it easy to save Dark from floating into the sky. Yet Jay just assumed Handy could still see, even though its glowing eye sockets were filled with wriggling leaves. Thankfully, these sentient leaves could not float the skeletons. So, the leaves do nothing. What else can she do? Jay waited and watched, while the skeletons pinned her down. They would probably be dangerous if they covered my body and suffocated me, but the skeletons don't need to breathe, making them pretty useless. But it doesn't explain why the firelights would fear her or her leaves. Her leaves would burn up in a second. The swamp woman, under the grip of 4 slimy skeletons, continued to struggle, panting, her face red and her hands shaking as she feared for her life. To hold her shuddering body down with more weight, the skeletons had each planted a hand into the rotting dirt, digging them into the soil and using their own hands as anchors. The panicked woman soon ran out of energy, and her fear began to turn back as she realized the skeletons weren't attempting to kill her and eat her flesh, as she thought they would. They were simply holding her still. As she stopped struggling, all she could see was dirt, as they had pushed her onto her stomach. The only thing she could hear was the sounds of her leaves, trying to pull a skeleton away. They sounded like hissing grasses shifting in changing winds. Higatha tried to catch her breath and think clearly, and this was when she heard something else drawing near. The sounds of splashing water approached, as if lots of rocks were being thrown into the swamp waters en masse. And then, she heard something that was almost as alien to her as the skeletons. Something she had not heard in a very long time. A human voice. It had been such a long time since she heard a voice. It was something she had almost forgotten, the warm, dangerous sound of another. It seemed like a dream or even her panicked imagination. It felt so uncomfortable to even be observed by someone else as she had kept herself hidden for so long. It was as uncomfortable as the pile of skeletons on top of her back. But still, it called out, hidden somewhere in the fog. Hello. Higatha. Listen, I'm not here to hurt you. I need your help. Jay said, trying to imagine what he would want to hear if he were in her predicament. I'm coming across. I will not harm you if you don't harm me, but be warned, if you try anything, I will have the skeletons drag you into the water and hold you under. After that, we'll see who suffocates first, Jay thought. Higatha grunted, grabbed a handful of dirt tightly, and she grit her teeth, straining her body against the skeletons. Well, Jay called. Why? Araspiel came back through the fog. Why what? Jay replied. Why should I help you? Yes. Why should she? Jay wondered. He didn't want to jump straight to threatening her. It was the simple solution, but it would leave a bitter taste in his mouth if he did. Sullivan's flimsy noon blanket doesn't make up for the time I was threatened, though it's funny how he came to try and appease me. I'm sure we can arrange something. It looks like you don't have much in the way of shelter. Or I could get you off this island. No. Just leave. She grunted back. Ah, this crazy woman, Jay thought, but heard something clinking behind himself. Suddenly, the sub-skeletons had appeared, and while they were covered in scorch marks, they were not empty-handed. Delicately gripped in 2 bone fingers, one of them had a prize for Jay. A tiny amber-colored marble. Slightly misty and see-through. But it wasn't made from amber, sap or glass. Crystal maybe. Jay wondered, grabbing it from the skeleton. This is good, but I thought I told you guys to bring the corpse back. Yet before analyzing it, he had to deal with Higatha. Holding the amber sphere in his fingers, Jay called out again. What do you know about the floating lights? The unhealing fire. The branchless burnt trees. The children's voices in the amber marbles. His voice traveled through the fog, and for a moment, there was silence. As Jay started into the shadowy mist, he scratched his chin, wondering if she heard him. NEO v Euros Rapture marked the initial hosting of this chapter on NEO Circumflex v Euros LSZN. Maybe she's thinking all the sounds of the rustling leaves have stopped. How did you escape? Who sent you? Escape? What is she talking about? Seeing Azra in pain, he had enough of this woman's maddened rambling. Well, he hadn't confirmed it yet. It did seem like she was doing something diabolical with children, and he wouldn't stand for that. Jay was standing in the middle of the swamp on a half-built bridge of bones. He had released thousands of skeletons so far to make this bridge of the dead, and could only just see the bank of the swamp island under the fog. To finish the bridge across, he released thousands more of these bones, all of them splashing into the water like a landslide. He did a quick check of his gauntlet, which held hundreds of thousands, and finally, it went down 1%. 66%. He periodically turned back to add some back into his necrotic gauntlet, but it threatened to destabilize his bone foundation, so he couldn't salvage them all. Meanwhile, something below the surface began eating away at the bridge. Because of this, many bones were lost to the swamp's dark waters, and soon hundreds of bone-eating creatures gathered as the waters rippled, filling up with bubbling as the abyss consumed this feast. Red's guardian skeleton stepped off the bridge first, followed by Jay stepping onto the island too, with Red by his side who still carried Azra. I guess we won't be making too many trips across, Jay thought, glancing back at the turbulent waters in his gauntlet. I can't keep using these bones so wastefully. He raised his necrotic gauntlet, his necrotic mana pulling as many bones back from the waters as it could. Now we'll see if this woman will help, or if I'll need to force her to, he frowned, not really wanting to threaten her into compliance. Chapter 325. Contractor. Archer's left its stealthy spot on the bank, pushing its covering of leaves and dirt off to stand alongside Red's two guardian skeletons. Azra watched patiently as Jay carried out his plans, not raising a questioning brow or even shaking her head. She didn't look worried, and it seemed she trusted him. Since losing trust in so many people, Jay thought trust was quite valuable, so it was quite flattering that someone would dare to trust him, and he would not hurt that trust by treating it cheaply like so many others did with his. Jay nodded at Archers as it stood by their side, and it nodded back. Archers nodded Azra too. Azra was in pain, but Jay thought he saw the hint of a curled lip behind her aching frown when it nodded at her. Is she growing fond of the skeletons? He briefly thought, having more pressing matters to deal with. The swamp woman was still pinned down by his skeletons, and had been for a while now. She's either beginning to calm down or accept her fate, but I don't want to make her more crazy than she already is. Jay could only just see her thick body through the fog with his own eyes. It was hard to tell after looking through the black-white shade vision, but her skin had a healthy sprinkling of pigmentation, and was both pale white or stained black from the swamp. There was hardly any color to it at all. If not for her hulking size, she would seem sickly and frail. Jay made sure that blue covered Higatha's eyes so she couldn't see him. As for the leaves she controlled, they had stopped trying to lift the skeletons, and were floating over the swamp waters, not protecting her, threatening the skeletons or Jay. Odd, she's not using them for either defense or attack. He called out to the swamp woman, "You asked before if I escaped. Escape what you? And who do you think may have sent me? Just kill me, fiend." Fiend, does she think I'm a monster? I suppose I can't blame her. Jay glanced at his skeletons. The woman was quiet, ready to accept her death. Listen, I let you analyze me to prove I'm human, but if anything weird happens, my skeletons will drag you into the water and disassemble you. I imagine whatever is lurking down there will immediately smell your blood and finish the job. Jay slowly walked closer, taking the risk. He held his hand behind his back. In between his fingers were 3 teeth, each of them beginning to tremble with necrotic energy. 3 unstable teeth spells were brewing. Blue, uncover her eyes. Jay slowly went closer, using his analyze skill repeatedly, until he was close enough to get a notification. Higatha level 27. HP, 100%. MP, 0%. She gazed back, watching the approaching shadow with widened eyes, breathing faster, until finally, Jay was close enough to analyze too. Bob level 4. HP, 100%. MP, 34%. Her fists relaxed, releasing the dirt, as she saw that Jay was truly human. Instead, she raised a brow. How could he be controlling skeletons? Skeletons that were much higher level than him. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a sigh, as she was not about to be finished off and killed, and while an intruding human in her territory was not a welcome sight, it was better than the alternative. Meanwhile, this human was only level 4, and had the nerve to question her. What do you want? She glared at Jay. I already told you. My friend needs help. The fires attacked her with an unknown fire. Can you fix it? No. The damage is permanent. She spat. Fuck. Well, it sucks to be Azra. I guess I'll have to ditch her, since she will just be a hindrance, though she has been kind enough, so maybe I'll get a skeleton to carry her home, if she can offer me something valuable, Jay thought. The swamp woman grunted and pushed her head up slightly. Well, are you going to leave now? Jay glanced at Blue, and the skeleton knew what Jay wanted. It grabbed the back of her head and pushed it back into the ground. What do you know about the lights in the fog? And is the fog you're doing? Nothing, and no. She huffed. How could she not know? I don't even need to use my liar's blood skill to smell such obvious bullshit, Jay thought. Deceiver's scent. Blood carries the stench of lies. She just doesn't want to help me. I wonder if these little amber balls will change her mind. Jay still had the amber sphere that the skeletons had brought him, but he didn't need to risk bringing it closer to show her. Sweeper. Jay ordered a skeleton near, giving it a few commands. The skeleton dashed over and carefully grabbed the translucent sphere from Jay, delicately holding it in the tips of its bone fingers. Sweeper took the sphere over to the woman, and Blue lit her head up slightly so she could see. Sweeper held it before her eyes. Even in the dark fog, the amber sphere had a subtle shine to it, like it was tempting her with a gleaming wink. Jay didn't say anything as he watched her mouth open wide. He thought she looked confused, but waited for her to speak. He wanted her to admit her lies as much as he wanted her to help Azra, but for some people, the former was much harder than the latter. The harmless amber sphere seemed to make the woman as excited as she was deranged. She was licking her lips with widened eyes. "That's mine," she yelled, breathing faster as her eyes stuck to it, pushing her head up, and trying to push off the skeletons again. "Sweeper, bring it back. But bring it back slowly." Jay smiled cunningly. "Wait. I can help your friend, just give me that," she called, fighting against Blue's skeletal hand on the back of her skull. This chapter was first shared on the NEOV Euros LS at 1N platform. She sounds so desperate, Jay thought, seeing her pleading. "I thought you couldn't help. Also, I think you know where I got this from," Jay lied. He didn't know where the skeletons plucked this tiny sphere from, but he guessed it was loot from one of the lights. The woman puffed. "I'll help. I just need more of those. Bring me those, and I'll fix her." The sentient leaves she controlled slowly began to move, but instead of returning to the woman or the skeletons, they went back to her rotting house, filling in the holes in the walls once more. "I'll make a deal with you. You help my friend, and I'll bring you more of these. But let's talk terms. How long will it take you to fix their unhealing wound?" Jay, as distrustful as he should be, believed the swamp woman would probably heal a part of Azra's wound, and then keep Jay gathering these odd little amber spheres for much longer than he ought to. And she seemed annoyed by the question as she angrily grunted. "Let me see the wound first," she called. Jay snapped his fingers, and Red brought Azra closer, closer than Jay was standing. In Red's arms, Azra was about 5 yards away from the swamp woman. It was close enough for the woman to use dangerous magic, but Jay didn't mind, as he wasn't the one in Red's arms. Besides, Azra could use her vampire compulsion to control the woman, but as she got closer, she didn't. Azra had been listening, and held her leg up to show the woman. Jay noticed the small detail. "So, it seems that Azra can only use it on one person," he thought. The flame wound was a small patch on the back of her lower leg. Only a lick of flame had brushed past her skin, but because of the foreign, otherworldly mana, it was enough to cause excruciating pain. "A few weeks." Jay scoffed. "A few weeks. She's lying again." Jay passed Sweeper his needle of hunger. "Use the side which makes them feel full." Jay winked. The skeleton took the needle, dashed over and pricked the woman's ankle, drawing some blood. The woman didn't even react to the needle. She probably thought it was just another swamp bug getting an easy meal, and was used to random stings and feeding probes. "A few weeks, huh?" Jay called. "Yes." She lied again. Sweeper brought the bloody needle back, and before he even brought it close to his nose, he smelled a stench which even made the swamp smell like a perfumed palace. "Don't lie to me again," Jay said, his face still twisted in disgust. "This is your only warning." The woman's eyes widened as her brows furrowed. Her lies, her deception, was all she had left to bargain with. "A few days." She grunted bitterly. "Good. And how many of these do you need to heal her?" "None." Jay grinned broadly, but he didn't let the woman see. "So she needs none. This fucking liar, but I suppose I am somewhat of a liar myself. Neither of them know my real name after all. So, you want these as payment?" "Yes, I want. I need every single one of them." "Why?" "It's not for you to know." "What?" "You won't understand. Just get me as many as you can, or you'll regret it someday." Jay couldn't smell any rancid smell of blood. She was telling the truth. Well, he didn't want to believe her cunning words, he had to. The blood didn't lie. Chapter 326. Another call. Jay looked out into the fog as he questioned the swamp woman. How can some strange floating flames cause harm to the entire world? They can't even stand up to my skeletons. Don't try and understand. If you don't want to help, just leave. The woman scowled. Jay sighed. Let her up but stay close to her. I'll send my skeletons to collect as many as I can. You'll heal Azra within 3 days. 3 of my skeletons will stay near you in case you try to harm us. She stood up, not even bothering to brush the dirt and rotting leaves away from her tattered, moth-eaten clothes, as she glared at Jay with bitter disdain. Fine. Am I allowed to move? She snapped, looking around at the skeletons. They still had their hands gripping her arms and shoulders. Jay nodded, and the skeletons surrounding her gave her some space. She walked closer to Azra, and strangely, she brushed away some hair from Azra's eyes. I can't make sense of this woman, Jay thought. For a moment he thought he saw a hint of compassion in her eyes, even though one eye was milky, and the rest of her form was grotesque. Her pale skin was covered with scars and blemishes, while her face was no stranger to a few large moles, each with their own long whiskers poking out. Poor Azra, Jay thought, not wanting to be touched by such a mountainous, rugged woman. He stepped back, and decided he would avoid Swamp Woman Higatha for the foreseeable future. Bring her into my home, she said, glancing at the skeleton. Red, carrying Azra, didn't move. Why would it obey a stranger? Trace the lineage of this substance back to the dawn of NOV Euros LSZN. Go on. Jay pointed, and as Red went in, Jay gave it some hidden telepathic orders. Think for yourself, Red. Don't let her harm any of us, but do what it takes to help Azra. Jay silently coached Red as it walked into her stinking hut. 2 other skeletons, Blue and Sweeper, followed them inside. Higatha was huffing and frowning, looking annoyed at having so many things inside her house, but she didn't dare to complain. Having 3 skeletons following her into her shack was better than being dead. I think I'll stay out here, Jay nodded, thinking the air was probably much fresher, despite the putrid gases endlessly spilling from the swamp. All right, I better work on my end of the deal, but should I wait on the island with Azra and Higatha, or on the other side of the swamp? He wondered. Bubbles and waters continued swirling, as something below was still feasting on the bone bridge Jay had dumped. If I go across I'll just waste more bones, and I'll need to come back to give her the amber spheres anyway. But if I stay, the skeletons will have to come underwater with them, and if something attacks them, some amber spheres could be lost. Jay wondered what he could do, but as he watched the swirling waters, he could only think of one solution. Looks like we'll need to slaughter our way out, he thought with a shrug, and began counting his troops. Blue, Sweeper and Red were with Higatha, while Blue's 5 sub-skeletons were still out hunting the lice across the water. This left Jay to command with 5 skeletons and Red's 2 guardian skeletons. Lamp, level 4. Shepherd's crook and gut knife. Handy, level 4. Bastard sword. Heavy, level 2. Asane arming sword and heavy shield. Dark, level 3. Slender jewel daggers. Red's level 1 guardian skeletons. 1 bone dagger each. Archers, level 1. After assembling the skeletons before him, Jay made 2 piles of bones on the edge of the water. One was for himself, which he placed his comfortable chair on top of. He didn't want any creeping, crawling bugs coming to seek his body warmed, and it was better to sit atop a barrier of bones than directly on the rotting ground. As for the second pile of bones, these were for summoning and crafting weapons, of course. Sitting on his throne, near the water's edge, Jay got them into formation. Face the water. Lamp and Handy, stand on either side of Heavy. Dark and Archers, stand behind Heavy. If you think other weapons will work better against whatever is down there, now is your opportunity to craft them. Red, have your guardians escort these. Handy was the first to step out of formation. Stabbing its large 2-handed sword into the ground, it began to craft itself a short sword. Archer stood eagerly by Handy's side, and was soon rewarded with a slender dagger, crafted by Handy, too. I guess his champion role let it craft a 2-handed sword, so crafting smaller versions and copying my swords were easy for it, Jay thought. When you're all ready, advance in the swamp. Protect each other and slay whatever is down there. Leave nothing alive. Lamp and Handy, you will make the decisions down there. Feel free to retreat and eat the bones when you need to. Lamp and Handy glanced at each other, then at the smaller skeletons, and then faced the water, slowly moving forward. The enormous bone pile Jay had left had attracted so many little bone-eating parrot eels, and now, the natural predators of these eels had gathered too. The skeletons bravely marched into the water, but as it got waist-high, they were already slashing and stabbing, splashing everywhere. 1x, 1x, 1x back 7. Seems like a lot are down there, Jay thought. Lamp and Handy did most of the killing, while Heavy planted its heavy shield down, acting as a tasty bulwark. Swords came scraping across the shield as the level 4 skeletons cleansed it of the grinding beaks feasting on it. 1x 9. 1x 5. Dark had crouched into the water, stabbing between the legs of the taller ones in front. 1x 6. It was a wall of piercing blades. Whether the eels attacked high or low, a swift sword would not be too far away from severing them. Archer's was not doing so well, but its small dagger was stained with some odd color of blood, so it was at least doing something, though it was hard to tell exactly what that was as the water was up to its neck. 1x 3. Red's 2 guardian skeletons were only slightly taller than Archer's, and were similarly struggling. Jay had not given them mines yet either, so their killing efficiency was dismal, and would probably not increase very much. 1x 4. The skeletons had started with slashes, but soon found that stabbing worked better, and would cause less splashing. 1x 27. In a few minutes, they learned another trick. They began to hold the tips of their blades in the water, luring the bone-eating creatures closer to their bone swords before striking. 1x 34. Jay also had his doubts about Lamp using its cumbersome shepherd's crook, but it seemed that it was using it to attack something other than the tiny bone-eating eels. Every so often, Lamp would glance into the deeper waters, and immediately raise the spear end of its shepherd's crook, then stab with all its might. It's keeping something away. Jay wondered, curious as he watched this small detail amongst the endless stabbing, slashing and splashing of swords. Chapter 327. Broken Trap. 1x 102. Every dead eel only gave 1x, but their numbers were almost endless. The skeletons did not advance further than waist deep, and after another 200 slain eels, they began their retreat, needing to heal and fix their mortal frames. To retreat, Heavy would lift its shield from the ground, while Lamp and Handy would help to push it back through the water, and would slam it down again as they culled more eels. Jay wasn't sure why they would retreat so quickly, as they had only been out there for a few minutes, but the skeletons were not the only things being eaten. All the dead bone-eating eels had attracted the flesh-eating fiends of the swamp, and compared to the bone-eaters, there were many, many more of the flesh-eating varieties. Oh shit, Jay thought. The skeletons marched back out of the water as the swamp became turbulent, and a feeding frenzy began. A new feeding frenzy of flesh. The dark waters of the swamp made vision useless. Everything lurking here relied on scent, taste, warmth or movement, and even a drop of blood would be like a shining beacon, calling in all who were hungry. The blood from hundreds of dead eels created their own distinct velvet purple patch in the black water. Jay had set things in motion which could not and would not be stopped. He had set the stage for a perfect bloodbath. Suddenly the water went perfectly calm. Even the skeletons knew what was about to happen. A primal fear had gripped all his hidden dwellers, all those hiding in the rocks and filth as the waters went still. Whoosh. Bubbles erupted. The waters burst into a rabid mess of death and tearing. Giant fins, beaks and jagged teeth. Tentacles, shells and pincer claws, all flashed above the surface in waves of carnage. It was every vile and hungry maw for itself. All as hungry as the next. Splashing blood and bubbles only served to draw out more predators lurking in the swamp, who then added their own blood to the cesspool. Jay scratched the back of his head. Oops, shit, well I guess this will fix the bone-eater problem. Jay shrugged, watching from his throne which had a front row seat to the chaos. It was hard to see exactly how many things were dying and perishing, and it became so violent that small waves began to lap against the shore. Some giants are fighting, Jay thought, seeing 2 large waves coming from either side and meeting. Whoosh. A giant tentacle shot from the water, sending dark rain over the swamp. The black tentacle had crimson barbed claws lining its side, and another one emerged. It held up in the bladed jaws of something which resembled a scaly wolf head, somewhat similar to a dragon. Maybe I should move back, Jay thought. In front of Jay's bone pile, just under the water, hidden leeches raised their heads from the decay, tempted enough to leave their holes and swim into the blood-filled abyss. They added their hungry maws to the frenzy. The loss of life was uncountable. Well, I can't help but feel partly responsible for this, Jay scratched his head, nodding slightly. Ah! A shrieking voice called. Higatha came out of her shack, hearing all the crunching and splashing. 3 skeletons chased after her as she ran to her rope and pulled it from the dark waters. Yet unlike last time, there was no trap at the end, nothing but a snap stick tied to the rope. She glared at Jay. How am I going to get food now? she yelled, pointing to the water. I'll make you a new trap. It shouldn't be too hard. Agatha grunted. 2 new traps. 2. She held out 3 fingers. Jay sighed, fine, and shook his head. HMPH. Agatha sneered, marching back inside while Jay watched her and the 3 skeletons leave. Just focus on healing Azra, you crazy old crone. Making a trap shouldn't be too hard anyway. I suppose I can't use bone though because there's things here that eat it. While the waters continued to rage, Jay left his throne to inspect the end of the rope. He took his sword and scraped it along the rope, getting off some of the black muck. Huh? Jay raised a brow. The rope was mostly blackened, forever stained by the insipid swamp, but a few golden glints of light sparkled back. A golden rope. Seems a bit too luxurious. Maybe she stole it and fled for her life. Jay glanced across her rotting shack, seeing her cursed and miserable existence. If that's the case, the theft was definitely not worth it. At the end of the rope was one snap stick, still barely attached to it. Normally it would be easy to find some sticks, but the trees out there don't have any branches. Jay scratched his chin. So where did she get the sticks? If she got them before the lights burned all the trees, then she was here before them. Maybe she's the reason the lights are here. I suppose it would explain why she knows how to heal Azra. Curious as he was, Jay went back to his throne, which was still perched on a pile of bones, overlooking the pool of death. He closed his eyes, picturing Red, and he felt weightless as the world went black and white. He used the host skill. Red was inside the rotting shack at Azra's side, watching Agatha closely. Unfortunately, his shade vision revealed every disgusting, darkened corner of this shack, all the trash and toenails piling up over the years, and many other things were better left unseen. A few bundles of dried mushrooms hung around the house. Some water-filled jars were randomly placed on shelves, which hosted a number of different wriggling and swimming creatures. Some looked humanoid, like tiny stick insect goblins, while others looked like disemboweled organs, still pumping and squeezing. Azra was lying on an old stained table, and Agatha stepped closer, ignoring the skeletons as she held her left hand out over Azra's leg. Some leaves from the walls floated down into Agatha's right hand, and she slowly began to crush them in her palm, before bringing it to her mouth. She's eating them, Jay thought. Each time Agatha ate a leaf, her hand above Azra's leg would glow, and the burn marks would begin to catch fire, though it gave off no light. A black flame, Jay thought. He was watching through the skeleton's shade vision, so everything was black and white, yet the flame made nothing shaded lighter. Even as it burned, the flame seemed to be feeding on the wounds. It seemed so backwards as the charred flesh started to disappear, little by little. After a few minutes, Agatha grunted. That's enough. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow and sat by Azra's side. With nothing else to see, Jay ended the host skill. A black flame that eats burns, but why eat the leaves? Jay sat in his chair, trying to make sense of it, as he watched the chaotic waters in front of him continue to tremble. I better get her some more sticks for another trap. Or something like them. It would be good practice for the skeleton's craftsmanship, too. After eating some bones, the group of skeletons in front of Jay had assembled again were ready to go into the water, but they were waiting for the feeding frenzy to stop. In the meantime, Jay gave them some other tasks. N0V3LREAM was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0V3LB1N. I need rocks. Stones. About the size of a fist. I want a pile of them here. Jay pointed on the ground next to his throne. Also, Red, leave Azra for a moment and join us outside. Chapter 328. 2 Minds. The skeletons would not question their master. If Jay was taking them off the grand duty of culling, and putting them onto something as lowly as rock collecting, they would give him as many rocks as he needed. They all darted off to different parts of the swamp island, all of them, except for Ed's 2 sub-skeletons, which didn't yet have minds. Red left the rotting shack and gladly rejoined its master's side. While it didn't have any expressions, it seemed to stand more proudly, puffing its chest out and pulling its shoulders back as it guarded Jay. Jay couldn't help but curl his lips slightly. Red, I'll be giving your skeletons minds. He glanced up at Red from his throne. Red nodded, and immediately, its 2 guardian skeletons left their weapons on the shoreline, stepped onto Jay's bone pile, and knelt before the throne. Which one first, Red? Jay smiled. Red glanced back at Jay with its lifeless green eyes. Jay couldn't tell what it was thinking, but after a moment it pointed to the one on the left. Jay held his hands out, hovering them at either side of its skull, and began to form its mind. His mana condensed and swirled like a storm around its head, like a thick green river, then disappeared, and left the inside of its skull gleaming like a night sky, with many little beads of green light running through. As the skeleton began to shake and convulse, Red held it back from Jay, who was already at work forming the mind of the second one. Jay wanted Red there, as it was the one in direct control of these guardian skeletons. He wasn't sure what the sub-skeletons would do if they were given a mind. "Don't give them any orders until I tell you to, Red," he ordered, wanting to test something. Red, holding the second skeleton in its arms, glanced up at Jay, and after a moment it nodded. After the skeleton stopped shaking, Red stood back by Jay's side, though it stood slightly more forward, closer to the water, between its sub-skeletons and Jay. "Well, that's not a good sign." Jay pursed his lips. The two skeleton guardians began looking at their hands, coming to terms with reality in their own way. Next, they noticed the bones they stood on, Jay's throne, and finally their swords, which were back on the shoreline. Each of them stepped back to grab their swords, curiously traced their bone fingers along the blade, and then glanced at each other. Then, they did something quite odd. They froze, locked into a stare. They both stood perfectly still as they stared at one another, not sure what to do. After they had their swords, it seems like that was the end of their instincts. Perhaps a part of their base instinct comes from Red, Jay wondered. And maybe Red has no instincts of its own. He watched them for a moment longer. "Hello." Jay held his hands out. The skeletons' bodies were still frozen, but then, they slowly turned their heads, their necks creating little clicking noises. So this is how other people feel, Jay thought, shuffling uncomfortably in his throne. Yet the skeletons fixed their eyes on Red, not Jay. They each stood side by side, with their swords lowered. It was like they were standing at attention. Red nodded at them, then turned to glance at Jay, and knelt in a display of respect. In a moment, the two guardian skeletons were on their knees, copying Red.L1 Lagoon witnessed the first publication of this chapter on NEOV Euros LB1N. "Ah, I see," Jay thought. "Alright, Red, give them all the orders, rules, and commands necessary." Jay waved his hand. "Maybe I should start calling them laws instead of rules." He scratched his chin, thinking that his laws would need more thought, as he was sure skeletons like Lamb would find all the loopholes to enact a culling of the innocent to harvest their skin. Until then, he would have to watch over them, making decrees as he went. Red began giving them directions, nodding, pointing and doing all sorts of gestures, while other times it simply stared into their eyes, communicating telepathically somehow. Jay wasn't sure exactly what they were saying. Perhaps they needed basic definitions, like what exactly a human was, or what it meant to kill something, or to die. Thankfully, the entire teaching process was quite fast, only taking as much as a minute. "Alright, now send them off to gather rocks, too," Jay ordered, keeping Red at his side. It didn't take long for a small pile of rocks to form at his side, most of them covered in black filth, after the skeletons dug them from the swamp's decaying earth. Jay watched as they piled up, but he didn't need many rocks for his purposes. "That's enough. Return to duties," he ordered, and the skeletons left their digging holes, reunited with each other, and prepared themselves to enter the water again, to cull more of the lurkers of the depths. Hopefully making an axe won't be too hard, Jay thought. While the skeletons could have used swords to hack trees down, the axes would make things much faster, and it was better to learn the blueprint now while he had some free time. Plus, with Red at his side, the skeletons would learn too. Jay remained sitting on his throne, and reached down, tugging out some bones from the pile he was sitting on. He released some necrotic mana from his gauntlet, making some molten bone which he formed into a sturdy shaft, about the length of his shoulder to his wrist. "Red, grab one of those rocks. Hold it here." Jay pointed to the end of the shaft. He melded the stone onto the end with more molten bone, and then melted other bones around the rock, covering it and fixing it to the shaft. After that, it was simple to form this heavy end into an axe head shape, then to sharpen the bladed side. Bone was light, but Jay could make it heavier by flooding it with mana, liquefying it, and condensing it. He wouldn't need a stone at all. However, it was much more simple to just add a rock into the craft, saving himself a lot of mana and bone by doing so. After tracing his fingers along the blade a few times, and fixing more bone between the head and the shaft for reinforcement, his creation was ready. Bone logging axe level 1, stone. 5 damage. 400% logging efficiency. Lifespan, passive. Requires necrotic essence to maintain its form. Current lifespan, 48 hours. Not bad. Jay nodded, handing it to Red to inspect. Made sure they only use it on trees, he ordered. Red nodded and inspected it, giving it some test swings, and after it seemed that it was done, Jay stashed it back into his inventory. Now, after they're finished killing everything in the water, I'll need about 7 axes. I suppose the smaller skeletons will need hatchets, Jay thought. Red, get me a handful of pebbles about the size of a ring, Jay said, pointing to his finger, and the skeleton scurried off to another part of the island. Jay stepped off his throne and walked down the bone pile to the black dirt. He dug a small hatchet-shaped hole, which was really just a smaller version of an axe, and filled it with bones, then melted them together with a small stream of mana. Some of the molten bone overflowed, but he simply scraped the excess away. Red came back just in time, and Jay pointed into the molten bone, making Red drop the smaller rocks in. A small handful of rocks scattered into the hatchet-shaped hole, and before it could solidify, Jay made a smaller shaft for it, about the length of his elbow to his wrist. Placing the shaft into the mix along with some extra molten bone on top, he dispersed his mana, and pulled his new hatchet from the hole. He needed to make some finishing touches to make it even-sided, even-weighted, and to hide some of the rocks which poked out, as well as giving it a sharp blade edge, but after checking the damage of the hatchet, he was satisfied with his first try. Bone logging hatchet level 1, rocks. 4 damage. 400% logging efficiency. Lifespan, passive. Requires necrotic essence to maintain its form. Current lifespan, 24 hours. Nice, 4 damage. I was actually expecting 3. Jay held it while talking to Red, only 1 less than the axe. With the logging bonus it should do 16 damage to trees, while the axe will do 20. It must be a little better quality since I took more time with it, and smaller objects are a little easier to work with, too. He nodded, and glanced at Red. Red stared at Jay for a moment, and then nodded back, causing Jay to gently smile as if he were greeting an old friend. I'm glad there's someone I can share my thoughts and accomplishments with now. We just need to get through the water and start our deforesting operation. Chapter 329. Basement. 30x. Blue skeletons got another kill. Jay nodded, and started to dig more hatchet-shaped holes, matching them to the shape of the first hatchet, shaft included. While Jay dug 3 molds out and filled them with bones, Red was on pebble collecting duty, gathering small rocks about the size of rings. Anything smaller would slip through his fingers. Red, come here, Jay said, filling another mold with bones. Red dashed to Jay's side while he was crouching down, pointing to the molds. Release your mana into the molds until the bones are molten. Red nodded and crouched down, letting its necrotic green mana flow from its hand, causing 2 of the molds to give off a faint glow as the bone filled the mold. Jay sprinkled the smaller pebbles in and dispersed the mana from the mold, solidifying it. For the third hole, he had to fill it with mana from his own reserves, as Red ran out before it could complete all 3. Alright, that makes 4 hatchets and 1 axe. Jay nodded, and began fixing up the new hatchets, bringing them up to his standard. In the meantime, Jay instructed Red to polish its squire armor, making sure its gear was in order before sending it away. Red, switch out with Blue. I need its mana. Blue was still guarding Azra and Hagatha. Red darted away to the shack, and stopped at the door, pausing while looking back at Jay. Perhaps there was some adoration in its eyes, but seeing that everything was in order and that Jay was safe, it went inside, sending Blue out after it. Needless to say, Azra and Hagatha were quite confused seeing one skeleton enter only to replace another. Other than Red's shining armor, it really didn't make a difference, or so they thought. Blue was at Jay's side in a moment's notice. It watched and waited as Jay dug out 2 larger molds for axes, mostly using his necrotic gauntlet and a hatchet to dig into the dark earth. Before Jay could finish his second hole, Blue had already began to add bones into the molds, having gleaned some information from Red, though it already had experience making armor plates with this method, so making a tool wasn't much different. Jay nodded, and Blue filled the first mold with mana, melting the bones. As Jay dropped a heavier stone in, Blue tiled its head to the side in wonder, seeing this new idea. Stones and bones. It was simple to do, but simply absurd. Yet it wouldn't question its master, not that it could. Blue started to pack the second hole and make the molten axe while Jay watched. He pointed to the stones. Do the second one yourself. Blue hesitated, perhaps doubting itself, but grabbed a stone and watched Jay as he dispersed the necrotic mana in the molten bone right as the stone disappeared. This would ensure that the stone wouldn't touch the bottom of the mold and stick out the other side of the axe. Blue cautiously lowered the stone in, not wanting to fail its master. It seemed to have trouble dispersing the necrotic mana, perhaps because it was not used to doing such a thing. An undead creature dispersing its own life force would be insanity in any other situation. Yet Blue succeeded, and 2 roughly shaped axes were formed, each with heavy axe heads. Blue grabbed one and felt the weight of its chopping end, bobbing it up and down in its arms, and then giving it a swing before looking at the heavy axe head with a stone inside. Needless to say, it was impressed by the simple trick of embedding a stone inside. Jay decided to do the finishing touches himself, while he had Blue watching at his side. He added some reinforcing bones between the head and the shaft, made the handle smoother, and ran his mana-infused fingers along the blade to sharpen it, then finally checked its stats. Bone logging axe level 2, stone. 6 damage. 420% logging efficiency. Lifespan, passive. Current lifespan, 72 hours. Nice, that should be about 24 damage to trees. Jay thought, doing some hasty calculation before stashing them away, while sending Blue to make another. Jay didn't expect Blue to get it in one go, but nevertheless, he sent Blue away to craft one more because he wanted 4 axes in total. Even if it failed miserably, a low-quality axe would still be better than using swords. Probably. The other skeletons, tasked with culling the swamp waters, began their march back in after the larger predators stopped fighting and splashing around. After a few moments they were fully submerged without even having to stop to fight anything. Everything was dead, at least, the bone eaters were. As the skeletons traveled across the abyss, a series of notifications came through, and Jay knew exactly what was left, the last hungry mouths still standing after the frenzied bloodshed of swamp creatures and titans was complete. 8x 23. 8x. The leeches. Dark, stay under the water killing leeches, Jay ordered, deciding his assassin skeleton would need practice to be adept at fighting in extreme conditions. While the skeletons could see perfectly in the darkness, the swamp waters were cloudy with muck, forming an opaque barrier, and this would be good training for his assassin, helping it to rely on the feel of its body and the flow of water, tracing the subtle movements of prey. Jay quietly watched the water for a moment as he sensed Dark break off from the group, and thought to himself. Dark will hunt the leeches, and despite being the smallest, the ones trampled underfoot, and the scavengers of the swamp, it's the leeches that had the last bite. Perhaps there's a lesson there, maybe we need to be like the leeches. Jay scratched his chin. Blue finished another axe for Jay, while the group of skeletons reached the other side of the bank. Jay commanded the group first, collect the sphere that Blue's skeletons left, and come back. For good measure, Jay brought them back again to make sure the path was clear. Once they came back to Jay's side, he gave them their new axes while the amber sphere. Glancing back at the shack, Jay decided to drop the spheres off with Higatha before leaving, while checking on Azra to make sure she was well fed. He put his throne back in his inventory, and stored the bone pile under it back into his ring before going to her hut. He didn't bother knocking as there were holes around the door. Higatha, I have some spheres for you, and I'm checking on Azra before I leave to hunt. He called, but to no answer. Red opened the door, but there was still no answer from anyone. Azra was asleep on the table while Higatha had simply disappeared, along with Sweeper. Jay glanced down, scratching his chin. He could sense Sweeper somewhere below them, so Higatha must have had a basement, though looking around the room, there was no apparent way down. Maybe she's using the leaves to cover up the entrance, he guessed, walking into the house. Jay made sure Red held the door open as he brushed past the skeleton, not wanting to touch anything that Higatha had touched. Jay stood over Azra, who was lying on the table, and wondered how anyone could be sleeping in this stenching shack. Azra, he whispered. She must be exhausted from the pain. He gently tapped her shoulder. Azra. No response. Jay glanced at Red, giving his skeleton a regretful, awkward smile, then looked back at Azra again, reaching out his hand towards her face. Azra, wake up. He squeezed her nose. L1 Lagoon witnessed the first publication of this chapter on NEOV Euros LB1N. After a moment her cheeks filled with air, and her eyes opened widely. Ah. She breathed heavily, slapping away Jay's hand. Jay, what the hell are you doing? Don't do that. She furrowed her brows, angered to be awoken. Sorry, he whispered, I've just come to feed you before I go hunting. You haven't told her what you are, I presume. Are you okay here? No, I'm not okay, and of course I haven't told her. Just hurry up so we can get out of here, she pouted, and give me that blanket you have. Jay couldn't help but smile. Here. He gave her the blanket and then leaned down so she could access his shoulder. HMPH. She frowned, snatching the blanket, and then reached up, pulling his shoulder closer. Chapter 330. 3 Traps. Jay glanced down at her dark silky hair with its subtle sheen of crimson. It seemed so soft and clean, even in the humid swamp air. As she suckled on his shoulder, Jay raised his arm but stopped himself. Wait, why do I want to pat her hair? What's wrong with me? He shook his head. In a few moments she was finished. She licked the wound and tucked herself into his blanket. She wasn't impressed with Jay's antics, and the wound on her leg and the stinking shack only added to her misery. I'll be back soon, Azra. Red, Garter. Azra mumbled back. Jay left and Red closed the door, standing by Azra's side. Jay could still sense Sweeper somewhere below them, but decided to leave it to its duty. I'll drop off the Amber Spheres later, he shrugged. Initially, Jay had Red, Blue, and Sweeper guarding Higatha, but after seeing Higatha's compliance while healing Azra, he decided to keep Blue with him. With Azra safe, Jay walked back to the edge of the water and gave Blue some instructions. Blue, I want your sub-skeletons patrolling the depths, killing anything down there that eats bones. I also want them pushing any corpses further away from here. I have a bridge to make, and I can't have it collapsing when the corpses under it decompose or get eaten. Jay pointed to the water. I will just need a few guards to stop it from degrading, so Blue's minions should do the trick. The group of skeletons waiting by the shore had a bone snack to heal themselves, and received their new axes and hatchets. Some were still appreciating these new tools, and now they understood why their master sent them to gather rocks. Jay sent the group back through the water one last time, to truly make sure any bone-eating eels were truly dead, then stepped to the water's edge, and began construction of a second bridge. One that would last this time. Similar to other constructions, he dumped large bones down first, letting them stack up and form the foundation. Blue was sent to test it, jumping and stomping to make an unstable bone shift and collapse, until they fell into a stable position. Once the foundation was ready, Jay added gradually smaller bones until there was a flat layer of pebble-like bones on top, and in no time, his bridge was finished. He took more care this time as he wanted the bridge to last longer. Jay slowly made his way across the foggy black water, each step sending a few bone pebbles falling off the bridge and into the water, most of these pebbles being finger bones. Stepping onto the other shore, the band of log-cutting skeletons had already left the water, and Jay could already hear axes hitting wood, echoing through the fog. Goody nodded, whispering to Blue. For Jay's purposes, just one tree trunk would do, but he let them cut a few down, so they could get used to logging, and hopefully gain some experience. Bring the tree trunks back once you've cut them down, Jay ordered, waiting patiently on the side of the bank. While he had to do some culling to collect the spheres, he trusted the skeletons would be able to cull a significant portion of enemies, especially since Blue's smaller skeletons could manage to slay the firelights. It would be no problem for the higher levels. The birth of this content finds its genesis in NOV Euros LSZN. While waiting, Jay analyzed one of the amber spheres. Breaking shard. Unknown. Description. Unknown. A breaking shard. Jay raised a brow. How can it be a shard when it's a sphere? He wondered, rolling in between his fingers. And what's the difference between unknown and a question mark? The only other thing I have with a question mark is that large starry gemstone, which is probably an egg. Jay held the amber sphere between his fingers as it let off a slight shine, even in the gloomy fog. If this is an egg too, then what is Higatha doing with it? Well, I'm sure she won't mind or notice if one goes missing, Jay thought, and his lips curled into a smile. After a while, the skeletons began to bring some tree trunks back. Each trunk was a shen gray, about 20 feet tall, and the top had a smoldering ember, the same smoldering burn as Azra's wound. It was odd to see the embers as the tree didn't shorten or burn up. It remained the same length, even as the ember smoldered and smoked. Jay had them dip the burning end into the water, and it released some hisses and bubbles for a few seconds before dying down, but after they pulled it out again, it returned to a hot glow. It's like it's frozen in time, Jay guessed. He had seen time magic before, when Kel was practicing, but it was nothing like this. And it didn't explain how Higatha was fixing Azra's leg by eating crushed leaves, and without using mana. I'll figure it out later, he shrugged. Cut off the burnt ends, and put them in a pile near the water, then cut the logs in half down the middle, Jay instructed. So far, the skeletons had gathered 2 logs. There was a group of smaller skeletons using hatchets and were still cutting another tree, so Jay sent Lamp away to help them finish it off and drag it back. After the skeletons cut the log down the middle, he had them cut along the middle pieces again, then again and again. Much of the log split down the side and broke away, but it didn't matter, all he needed was to make some sticks. After the skeletons cut the logs into sticks, he had enough to make the 2 or 3 of the traps that Higatha wanted, but joining them together would be a problem. Knowing that Higatha used her sentient leaves to stick some bait to the trap, Jay guessed that she probably used them to hold the trap together too. It wasn't something he was capable of, and using bone to make the trap was no option. But I can't always rely on magic, he nodded. I shouldn't. Jay sent the skeletons out again, this time, to gather the long swamp grasses and the reeds from the water. The swamp grasses were either barbed or covered with tiny hair-like filaments which pierced the skin and caused itching. Some were simply full of a viscous poison. Over the years, even these grasses had grown resilient to the harsh swamp, accustomed to the world of hungry maws around them, still clinging to life despite the rotting decay and the lack of sunlight. Yet the skeletons weren't deterred in the slightest, easily bringing bundles of grasses back after a few swings of their axes and hatchets. The next step wasn't hard to instruct the skeletons to strip away the green parts covered in the barbs and needles, leaving the tough spine of the grasses, which they twined together. Creating something which resembled a cage wasn't hard to make, and while the twine and the quality of construction wasn't great, Jay didn't care that much. These traps weren't for him, and he certainly wouldn't be eating anything caught in them either. As a bonus, he would also give Higatha the bundles of chopped pseudo-sticks, and the long fibers left over from the grasses. If she's not happy with my work, she can do it herself. He shrugged, holding one of the traps. Suddenly, a mischievous smile appeared on Jay's face. He quickly sent a skeleton into the water to grab one of the corpses left over from the feeding frenzy, while he dipped each trap into the swamp waters, making them look like they had been used. The skeleton came back with a mangled jellyfish that had thick green, snake-like tendrils, and dark purple veins covered its body. Ugh, I hope that tastes better than it looks, Jay frowned. He carefully placed it into a trap before sending them back with a skeleton, his feet tapping across the bone bridge towards Higatha's front door. Now we can get on with the hunt. Jay glanced at his skeletons, and they assembled before him.